Who was the first Austrian? Who were the first Austrians? Have you ever asked yourself that question? I'm asking you that question now. I'm asking myself that question now. And I'm going to be answering that question. I'm going to be giving answers, not just a single answer. I don't think there is a single answer to that question. I think it depends what you mean precisely when you're asking that question. And I'm going to go through all of these. You might be asking yourself another question now, which is, why should I care? Valid question. Now, I think it's not actually just about the question I've posed here in the title. Rather, that question, which I will be answering, is an invitation to join me in this larger exploration of prehistory of Austria, leading all the way up to Roman times, to the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire in 476, which is going to be the topic of this video. I am planning for this to be but the first installment in a longer and increasingly detailed, discursive, tangential series on the history of Austria and anything that could vaguely be brought into being with that. So that includes all of the history of the Habsburg Empire, everything that happened after that. Includes a lot of Austrian culture as well, which I think you can't fully separate from history just like that, because the one influences the other. There's going to be a look at some level of geography as well, and also at larger conflicts, political, societal contexts that span not just Austria, but the whole of the European continent, and at times even farther beyond that. I'm intending this series to be both accessible to those viewers who know nothing about Austrian history as of yet, but also to have it be thought-provoking and interesting, and telling you new things for those that might already know a little bit about Austrian history or about European history more generally. So there's going to be a lot of kind of overall context, and then there's going to be a lot of detail as well on individual episodes, individual people relevant to Austrian history, all the way up until the present day. With all that, I'm going to be trying to have at least a little bit of theory, a little bit of kind of literature, sometimes that might be novels as well, breathing into that assembly of different things about Austrian history that I'm going to be talking about, so as to kind of keep it interesting. Throughout all of that, I'm sure that my own political standpoint of socialism will shine through as well. I was toying with the thought of calling this a people's history of Austria, but that's not really what it is. It's going to be in many ways a straightforward history of the country, but also one that is sharply critical, when I consider that to be necessary, of the standard orthodox historiographical ways of telling Austrian history that I personally might not agree with. My qualifications for all this, you might ask, is, well, I've got a history degree and I am Austrian. Not particularly patriotic. This is the closest thing I could come up with as some sort of a national dress. I've not lived in Austria for like 8 years now, but over the last 2 years, in that sort of post-master's degree minimum wage job slump, I've been increasingly putting myself to researching this, getting more and more interested, reading more and more books about the history of the country that I'm from, and just finding more and more threads to pursue that I've now decided I want to kind of share with people, whoever wants to watch. And if any of that sounds interesting to you, I would be really grateful if you kept tuning in, if you kept watching this video and see where it might go. Without further ado, let's get started with this. My name is Axel. This is Axel's History of Austria. I'm hoping to think of a pithier title for that down the road. But yeah, that's us. Let's go! Right, I've put some trousers on, made some coffee. Let's get started with this properly. I said there could be multiple possible answers to that question of who were the first Austrians. And that's not a wishy-washy academic answer. I actually do have, I didn't count it, I think I might have 4, maybe even 5 possible answers. And some of them are like genuine, definite people of a sort. You'll see when we get there. But depending on what you mean by that question, there can be different answers. So if we look at the territory of Austria today, when, as to the best of our scientific archaeological knowledge, is the earliest evidence of any kind of modern humans having lived in this territory, then there's a specific answer to that. Again, to the best of our knowledge, that is 250,000 years ago. If that's what you wanted to get out of this video, if your question was when were the first Austrians, then I suppose you could stop watching now. But don't, because, well, that's not what it says on the board there, right? The question was, who were the first Austrians? And to my mind, that answer, just pointing to the archaeological foundations, isn't quite right, because you can inhabit a territory, a piece of land, without therefore belonging to the kind of nation state or the polity governing said land, all the more so in times as long ago as 250,000 years ago. So that's one possible answer, right? But we could, and I think should be more precise and ask, if we are wondering about the first Austrians, who were the first people living in Austria who were aware that they were living or perhaps even governing a territory known as Austria to perhaps them or to the outside world? And then we too have a very specific year that we can point to, and that would be the year 996. 996, and I think this is something that a lot of Austrians, even with a dim memory of their history classes in school, would still be able to kind of tell you or summarize you in some sort, because the year 996, by which point the territory, or at least parts of the territory of modern day Austria, are already part of, I guess, what you could call like an embryonic version of the Holy Roman Empire. That year is when we have the first documented evidence of an area not entirely coterminous with the area of modern day Austria, but at least within the bounds of modern day Austria, being referred to as something like Austria. Now, this sounds tenuous, right? But the word that is used in this kind of official imperial document is Ostarrîchi, which, with, a bit of, etymological imagination, you can look at that and you can see where Austria, which comes from Latin, is in that word, sort of. It's a lot easier if you speak German, and if you know that the German word for Austria is Österreich, there the similarity is pretty obvious. But in any case, we know, etymologists know, that the source from that word directly leads to the modern day word of Austria. So that is a kind of solid point of reference, solid point in time to refer to when talking about the first Austrians. The meaning of that word, and that too is something that Austrians, indeed really German speakers, will generally be aware of, because again, it's kind of evident from also just how the modern day word for Austria sounds, is basically Eastern region, Eastern territory, or Eastern March. March being one of those medieval kinds of administering divisions within a larger region, within an empire. So in Austria, we had the Margraviate of Austria, that was a imperial division between 970 and 1156. After that point, we get the Duchy of Austria, the Archduchy of Austria, and from then on, we've got the Habsburgs in power, and Austria being, in many ways, the center of the Holy Roman Empire until its end in the 19th century. So from the historical evidence that we have, we know that from at the latest 996 onwards, people were referring to this region as Austria, or at least kind of a word roughly like the word Austria. So that could be our answer, right, for who the first Austrians were. But were they? The reason I'm asking this is because the rulers of this Margraviate of Austria, the House of Babenberg, were not themselves from Austria. The clue, once again, is in the name. Bamberg is a town in Bavaria, in Franconia, in the northern part of Bavaria, who were assigned, or who were awarded the territory of Austria, which again is a considerably smaller territory at this time still than it is today. Did the Babenbergs become Austrian simply by being given the Margraviate of Austria? If not, how about the Habsburgs? Because the Habsburgs too weren't Austrians to begin with. You know what the Habsburg is? As in the Habsburg as a genuine place that you can go to and touch, because Burg is the German for castle. The Habsburg, which is, the Habs castle. You can't say Habsburg castle because that would be a tautology. You would be saying Habs castle. It's the Habsburg, is in Switzerland. Yeah, so that's where the Habsburgs originally hailed from. And then their core territories were in northern Switzerland and southwestern Germany, the area of modern-day Freiburg and Breisgau. And only gradually did they shift the center of their realm to Austria further east. So I suppose my question is, does a noble ruler assume the national, perhaps even ethnic identity of the territory that he or she is ruling simply by being given that territory? When Georg Ludwig von Braunschweig-Lüneburg assumed the British throne, the crown of the King of Britain in 1714 as George I, did that also mean that he gave up his Hanoverian, his German identity in favour of an English or a British one? Did he hold both at the same time? Was he still more German than English by the end of his life if he spoke English with a strong accent and preferred speaking in German? You could argue that I'm just splitting hairs here, right? But I think this is an important question to ask, in particular when looking at the Middle Ages and at even early modernity, when we still have feudal and monarchical structures in place in Europe, because are the noble rulers of these many small territories that in particular the Holy Roman Empire was comprised of, were they really beholden to the territory they were representing, or were they not most of all beholden to their identity as noblemen, as noble women? This is a strictly class-based hierarchical society that we're looking at here. And my question is perhaps this: was the Habsburg Duke of Austria in the 14th century more of an Austrian or more of a Habsburg? I talked a bit about like wanting to do something of a people's history of Austria at the beginning, and I won't claim to anything as comprehensive as that from the research that I've done, which is mostly based on historical sources, but I will be intending to kind of bring up questions like this every now and then. And for example, in this case, ask, isn't it more important when ordinary Austrians started feeling or referring to themselves as Austrian, started thinking of that as their own national and or ethnic identity? And if that's where our focus lies, then surely the date has to shift much, much later than what we've looked at so far. Were ordinary people living in Austria, or let's be a bit more generous here, were educated people who could read in Austria at any point, say the 14th, 15th century, to what extent were they aware of inhabiting a territory, a region, a polity known as Austria? At what point does nationhood and ethnic identity of this sort become absolute? Perhaps a more instructive way of looking at this is to ask, at what point does the identity we are looking at here trump all other identities? Let me give you a specific example for this. I live in Scotland, right? And in Scotland, like anywhere else in the world, in any territory where there's a strong nationalist movement objecting to the foreign rule of that territory by another state, the question of whether you consider yourself as first of all Scottish or as first of all British is not a neutral one. It's not an apolitical one. It will be dependent on a lot of factors, in particular religion, but also the kind of geographical area that you're from, your class allegiance, your class background. Same is true for Northern Ireland, of course, and you can extend that to other regions of the world with nationalist movements, whether that be, Catalonia in Spain or who knows where. Another example might be the degree to which an individual in a European country considers herself as first of all European rather than belonging to the nation state whose passport she owns. Right. And there's, again, statistics, polls on this that will show in particular a lot of Northern European countries, whether it's, in Scandinavia or whether it's Germany or the Low Countries, Belgium being obviously the center of the European institutions. A lot of, in particular, younger individuals increasingly identifying themselves as first of all Europeans rather than as, Belgians or Swedes or Germans or as Dutch, whatever. And obviously, I think that trend, as positive as it is, seems to be on the decrease again after having reached a peak some years ago. I think we are increasingly now in an era where the kind of 19th century institution of a nation state is trying one last stand at reestablishing itself. And that means, stronger, stricter borders. And it means defining and policing very strictly who is allowed to belong to the body politic that makes up the nation state. If we get back to the Austrian example here, I mean, you can obviously tell what I'm getting at. The fact of the language being a significant barrier to defining Austrian as an identity in opposition to German as a different identity of its own. Austrians, unlike Hungarians, unlike the Slovenes, unlike the Czech, don't have their own linguistic identity to back up their claims to a territorially defined nation state. We speak German with a different accent, a different dialect, but it's ultimately fundamentally the same language. Because of this, until well into the 19th century, ordinary German-speaking people in Austria would have thought of themselves as Germans. Doesn't mean that they only exclusively thought of themselves as Germans, but if we were to make a ranking, would they have considered themselves as Austrians first and Germans second? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they would have considered themselves as Germans first, and then maybe as citizens of the Habsburg Empire second, of the Habsburg monarchy. And then maybe third, they would have considered themselves as belonging to the specific region of Austria that they're from, say the Tyrol or Styria. A lot of the regions that make up present-day Austria have strong cultural signifiers that set them apart from the other regions of the country. And then maybe they would have considered themselves as Austrians only fourth, and then all of that gets complicated even more if we bring the many other ethnic national identities of the Habsburg Empire into the mix. And of course, there was a considerable extent of moving to different parts of the empire, of intermarriage as well. Today, the question of are Austrians Germans can be answered with a fairly resounding no. I mean, you don't have to ask sociologists for their opinion on that. You can go into literally any city or town anywhere in Austria and just poll the local population, and it would be quite hard probably for you to find a single person to say that they would consider themselves as German rather than Austrian. And if they said so, you could probably surmise a good deal about their political leanings from that answer. But the fascinating thing is how recent of a development that is, considering how strongly felt that sentiment is by Austrians all over the country. And really, it's 1945, right? It's the horrendous turn that things took the last time that Austria and Germany were united in the same nation state that today means the question is no longer even worthy of discussion and seems to be settled forever. Does that make 1945 the answer? No, it doesn't, right? We do have to go back to the 19th century if we want to answer the question of when did ordinary people in Austria begin considering themselves as Austrians above all else. Because in the 19th century, in the post-Napoleonic congressional order of things, which was that kind of weird period, I would almost want to call it an interregnum between 1815 and 1848, that even now that the Holy Roman Empire had ceased to exist, the Austrian emperor, the Habsburg emperor, was still the hegemon of the German-speaking territories of Europe. And increasingly, it would be the Prussians that would rally against that and ultimately usurp that role from the Austrians with a victory in the Austro-Prussian War in the 1866 Battle of Königgrätz. From that point onwards, Austrians, not all Austrians, but in particular the Austrian Habsburg leadership, will be distinctly in favor of the Kleindeutsche Lösung, the small German solution, in which Austria, ideally with as many territories in Eastern Europe as it can hold on to, constitutes a separate state from the northern German parts, led above all by Prussia, whereas the Großdeutsche Lösung, the big German solution, would be implemented obviously by the Nazis when all of, or at least many of the German areas, the German-speaking areas in Europe were united under Hitler. And so in all of this, is there a single first Austrian that we can point to who asserted an Austrianness above a Germanness? Is it Emperor Franz II of the Holy Roman Empire, who in 1804 switched jobs to become the Austrian emperor, who proclaimed the Austrian Empire and shortly thereafter in 1806 dissolved the Holy Roman Empire as, at this point, kind of a precautionary measure because it was about to go to ruins anyway? Was it Clemens von Metternich who, in the congressional order, was really the most important political figure in the Austrian Empire, more important than the emperor, really, in asserting the power of the Austrian Empire in the face of the Prussians and of the other sort of obstreperous German territories? I mean, there is a different future entirely, a different status quo, where there is no single Germany, but there are smaller German-speaking nation states like Bavaria, like Baden, like Prussia, like Hesse. But of course, Metternich himself can't really be the first Austrian because he was German. How does that change the fact that he served as the chief diplomat of the Austrian Empire for more than a third of a century, until 1848? Perhaps Napoleon was the first Austrian. I'm not fully serious with this, of course, but you've got to think of the Napoleonic Wars, or the kind of French Revolutionary Wars, and then the Napoleonic Wars. 25 years of nearly uninterrupted warfare at a scale that Europe hadn't seen since the 30 years, over 150 years prior, in which the ideals of the French Revolution, of liberty and freedom, of democracy, of secular, rational thought, were being distorted in this strange new way that established how nation states would function from there on. I mean, so many of the nation states that we know today owe so much of their present-day existence to the Napoleonic era. So does the kind of movement for a Germany as independent from Austria. That too was a result of the Napoleonic era. Now, to sum up this entire theoretical discussion between the big German solution and the small German solution in one single theoretical construct, which is really useful here, that would be Schismogenesis. It's one word. Schismogenesis is a term coined by the anthropologist Gregory Bateson. It sounds complicated, but it's a super, super useful concept. It's basically a very simple idea at the root, that is that people define themselves by what they are not. They define themselves against each other, against someone else. And that works for just about everything. I mean, it works for religions, for Catholics and Protestants. It works for, habits and customs. The reason that a lot of people in East Asia eat with chopsticks rather than knife and fork is not because old racist ideas about them having never had the profound genius to come up with implements like knives and forks. I mean, they have spoons too, but rather because they saw other people from the West or other parts of the world eating with knives and forks, and they were like, no, we like our way better, because that is what makes us us.
Now, Bateson introduced this concept in the 1930s in a narrower sense, but the anthropologist David Graeber and the archaeologist David Wengrow, in their collective book The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, broadened this concept to refer to nations and peoples overall. They write, the anthropologist Gregory Bateson coined the term schismogenesis to describe people's tendency to define themselves against one another. How, he asked, do boys and girls in Papua New Guinea, which is the society that he was studying, come to behave so differently, despite the fact that no one ever explicitly instructs them about how boys and girls are supposed to behave? It's not just by imitating their elders, it's also because boys and girls each learn to find the behaviour of the opposite sex distasteful and try to be as little like them as possible. What start as minor learned differences become exaggerated until women come to think of themselves as, and then increasingly actually become, everything that men are not. And of course men do the same thing towards women. Bateson, write Graeber and Wengrow, was interested in psychological processes within societies, but there's every reason to believe something similar happens between societies as well, and this is what Graeber and Wengrow get in. They write that people come to define themselves against their neighbours. Urbanites thus become more urbane as barbarians become more barbarous. If national character can really be said to exist, it can only be as a result of such schismogenetic processes. English people trying to become as little as possible like French, French people as little like Germans, and so on. If nothing else, they will all definitely exaggerate their differences in arguing with one another. Another anthropologist, the Frenchman Marcel Mauss, wrote on similar questions, and again I'm quoting Graeber and Wengrow here. I don't have precise page numbers for this as I read their book online. As all of David Graeber's books, it is freely available to be read online, distributed freely according to Graeber's anarchist principles. I would highly encourage anyone to read it. And with respect to Marcel Mauss, they write that he argued that people in past times appear to have travelled a great deal more than they do today. And it's simply impossible to imagine that anyone back then would have been unaware of the existence of, he gives some examples here, basketry, feather pillows, or the wheel, if such objects were regularly employed a month or two's journey away. If everyone was broadly aware of what surrounding people were up to, and if knowledge of foreign customs, arts, and technologies was widespread, or at least easily available, then the question becomes not why certain culture traits spread, but why other culture traits didn't. The answer Mauss felt is that this is precisely how cultures define themselves against their neighbours. Cultures were effectively structures of refusal. I really like this concept, structures of refusal. Societies, wrote Mauss, live by borrowing from each other, but they define themselves rather by the refusal of borrowing than by its acceptance.
And the reason I love this so much with the Austrian example is because I'm going to try to keep this professional here, but in general, we Austrians don't have a high view of Germans. I know loads of lovely individual German people, but we do love to hate on them as a nation, as an idea. And so what schismogenesis really comes down to in the Austrian case is Austrians started being Austrians when we started hating Germans. When we started saying, that's them, but this is us. Is that a satisfying answer to when Austrians became Austrians? You're allowed to say no. I will be giving you some more tangible, specific answers, or at least ideas to who the very first Austrians individually might have been in a more straightforward historical account that you'll be familiar with in the second half of this video. But if these are the kind of ideas and questions you enjoy being explored, then I'd love it if you kept tuning in as we now get into the nitty-gritty of Austrian prehistory and of Austria under the Romans all the way until the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But halt! Prehistory? That's the term that people use, right? I mean, you know what I mean when I say that. Cave people, Stone Age, all that jazz. But should we be using that term? Right, so I have swapped out my national dress for my historian's garb to get into the facts and figures of the prehistory of Austria. Now, why have I put the pre in question marks here? It's because the term prehistory is somewhat contested. I mean, of course, the pre kind of suggests that this is not yet history, that what we're looking at is kind of a prelude, which is a strange way of looking at things when you consider that prehistory contains about 99% of all of human history within it. I mean, this starts over 3 million years ago and only ends some 5,000 years ago when our actual history begins, so to speak. So some historians prefer the term pre-literary history, which is more accurate in pointing to when prehistory ends, which is when writing systems start. So that's about 5,000 years ago. But I mean, that too, you can challenge that because you could ask, what is writing? Aren't, cave paintings writing of some sort? I mean, it's communication through symbols. Isn't that what writing is when it comes down to it? A lot of people, debated those questions. At the end of the day, I mean, the term itself, prehistory, still retains its usefulness in a way. I mean, you instantly know what this video is going to be about just by me saying the term. So I have stuck with it here. But at the same time, we should bear in mind that obviously by using that very term, we are showing our kind of implicit bias towards written historical sources. But with that out of the way, let's backtrack to something that I said earlier in this video about the earliest known traces that we have of human habitation in the territory of modern-day Austria, that being some 250,000 years ago, right? The BP stands for British Petroleum, although in this case it stands for before present. As a good historian, or even just as a human hungry for knowledge, your next questions to that should be, well, who were they? Where were they? Why were they there and not elsewhere? What were their names? What was their favorite flavor of crisps? I'm going to try to answer as many of those questions as I can, beginning with the precise where, which we do actually have a location for, which happens to be very close to my heart and more, geographically speaking, closer to my own origins in a part of Austria called Styria. So Styria is one of the 9 regions of Austria, gradually integrated in medieval times as part of the Austrian state. And there, if we look, you've got the city of Graz, which is the second biggest city of Austria, the capital of Styria. And just north of there, on the Mur River, which is one of the main rivers in Austria, you've got a town called Pegau, which isn't really known for much of anything, except that there, or at least in the vicinity of this town, there were stone tools found in a cave that archaeologists have backdated to 250,000 years ago. This area in central Styria, we know to have been a very popular settlement area all throughout prehistoric times. And the reason for this is caves. Caves were in high supply in the central Styrian region. And of course, if you imagine yourself in the I was going to say shoes, but they wouldn't be wearing shoes, would they? But in the body of a cave person, caves are like free real estate, right? They're a free house, and so naturally caves were popular. The next question, however, would be, why were there caves in this particular region of Styria? And here too, do I have an answer for you. And the answer to that is karst. Yeah, not Karsten. I don't know what's up with that guy. Karst, which is actually derived from a place or kind of a plateau, the Karst Plateau, some kind of mountainous area in Slovenia, but which is more generally speaking a kind of topography, sort of a landscape feature. I remember my geography teachers all the way throughout school boring me to sleep with talk about karst, going on and about it, because at the end of the day it's basically just stones, right? And I'm not selling this well, but karst is crucial to all of this, because karst is essentially a kind of landscape where you've got limestones in particular, among other types of stones as well, that are liable to being gradually eroded by rainfall. So what that leads down the line, a very long line, is fissures in the terrain and a higher likelihood of caves. So that's a completely naturally occurring phenomenon due to the environment, due to the geography of this region in not only central Styria, there's other parts of Austria where this is the case as well. And I mean, there's plenty of evidence for this. So you've got, for example, just nearby Pegau again, the Lurgrotte, which is considerably younger, an estimated age of some 50,000 years ago, but really quite impressive, really very well preserved. I'm lucky to have visited myself, although I don't really remember much about it. I was quite young. But then you've also got in Lower Austria, further north near Krems an der Donau, the Gudenus cave from about 70,000 years ago. So kind of like to the northwest of Vienna here, a straight line north from St. Pölten. This likewise is due to the preponderance of karst topography in the area around Krems. So what we're looking at with karst, or as we say in Austria, karst, is essentially a case of environmental determinism, right? The environmental, naturally occurring conditions led to this or these regions being where the first human inhabitation was possible on the territory of modern-day Austria, to the best of our knowledge again. So environmental determinism, that's a school of thought in history and anthropology and sociology, with its fair amount of detractors, because in general, it's a way of thinking about the world and thinking about world history and human history that explains things happening through climatic or through geographical conditions. I mean, this goes all the way back to Greek philosophers who had fairly blunt and relatively unrefined ideas about colder climates being conducive to rational thinking and democracy, and warmer climates being conducive to authoritarian rule because, people's blood boils faster and things like that. And in the modern sort of enlightened era, it was adapted in particular in Germany in the 19th century. We had, for example, the ethnographer Friedrich Ratzel, who was the first to introduce a concept called Lebensraum, a place to live, which went on to have much darker connotations of essentially a certain area of land being destined exclusively for a certain group of people. I mean, that was notably repurposed by the Nazis as the rationale for their wars of expansion and genocides in Eastern Europe. So while kind of those connotations made that particular facet of environmental determinism a bit passé after the war, it has seen a sort of resurgence since the 1990s in a lot of kind of Western academia. You've got in particular the American historian Jared Diamond, who wrote a book called Guns, Germs and Steel, which it's a more refined take on environmental determinism. I mean, it doesn't kind of just point to the colder climate of Europe and say this is why Europe is superior compared to like tropical climates, the way that was common in the 19th century. But at the end of the day, and this is the problem with all of environmental determinism, in attributing such importance to the environment, it grants very little agency to individual humans. So, for example, in Diamond's book, he explains Europe's rise in the early modern era through geographic factors. So he points, to an easier access to horses, the fact that Europeans were immune to certain germs and were therefore able to colonize the New World, the Americas. And there's arguments like, in Europe, it was more densely settled and you ran out of trees quicker. And, none of this is like wrong in itself in a vacuum, but trying to explain broader swathes of human history simply through these environmental conditions, it kind of takes out of the equation, well, why would Europeans have gone to the New World in the first place?
To again return to Graeber and Wengrow's Dawn of Everything here, they've also written about environmental determinism and what's questionable about this approach to anthropology or history. They write, environmental determinists have an unfortunate tendency to treat humans as little more than automata, living out some economist's fantasy of rational calculation. To be fair, they don't deny that human beings are quirky and imaginative creatures. They just seem to reason that in the long run, this fact makes very little difference. Those who don't follow an optimal pathway for the use of resources are destined for the ash heap of history.
But really all I'm saying with this is tread carefully. In an instance such as when looking at the prehistory of Austria, I think we're absolutely looking at an element of environmental determinism here, because it is precisely those parts of the country that were most easily inhabitable by people in the Stone Age that were first inhabited. With that said, let's leave the theory aside for a moment and let's look at the actual historical periods that we're working in here. 250,000 years ago, that is part of the Stone Age. Right, now everyone knows about the Stone Age. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. But I think there's a sort of a common misunderstanding that, we've got you've got the Stone Age, you've got the Iron Age, you've got the Bronze Age, you've got the Copper Age, the Chalcolithic, and that they all kind of take up some 5,000 years, and then there's one after the other, and then, the tools get better and better and better until today we've got iPads. But no, wrong. The Stone Age is like 99% of all of human history. And I already said that about prehistory as such. And there's actually a big overlap between prehistory and the Stone Age most of the time when you're talking about either it's kind of the same time period that we're looking at. The difference between prehistory and the Stone Age is more of a kind of discursive one. It's like whether you, in an archaeologist's way, put the focus on the tools that are being used by humans at a given point in time, or whether in an anthropologist's way or an historian's way, you look at whether we have written sources yet or we don't. For most of human history, people work with stones. And then there's other concepts that I think are sometimes mixed up, because when we look at the Paleolithic and the Neolithic and lithic terms like that, we are in fact still talking about the Stone Age. The lith in those words means stone. It's the Latin for stone. So those are in fact incremental divisions of the Stone Age. So you've got the Paleolithic, and then you've got the Mesolithic, and then you've got the Neolithic, which, as the Neo suggests, is near the end of the Stone Age. So 250,000 years ago, I mean, this all kind of depends where you are in the world, because obviously kind of civilization develops differently in different parts of the world. But 250,000 years ago in Austria, we are in the Middle Paleolithic. After that, you've got the Upper Paleolithic, which is a very, very important time in human history, because it's during the Upper Paleolithic that we begin to observe behavioral modernity. So behavioral modernity, what does that mean? That means abstract thinking. That means symbolic behavior, song and dance. So generally speaking, this is after what historians refer to as the cognitive revolution, which is a really radical transformation in the kind of humans' capabilities, psychological capabilities, that has sometimes been attributed, you might well be familiar with this, the kind of magic mushroom theory, although there's other theories about this as well. As with much of prehistory, we just can't quite say for sure. There's only plenty of theories around. The Upper Paleolithic is also the time when we see modern humans, as in Homo sapiens, migrating from the cradle of modern humanity, which is of course Africa, to other parts of the world, to Eurasia, which are the two continents that are directly accessible by land from Africa. Of course, you have many different other kinds of homos living through these periods as well, and in different parts of the world. And please don't take this out of context and post snippets of me talking about other kinds of homos. You know what I mean when I say that. But in Europe, obviously, you've got the Neanderthals, which is pronounced like that, with a t and not with a th sound. The Neanderthal is a place in Germany. Tal just means valley in German. Yeah, sorry, I'm a stickler about that. It's Neanderthals, not Neanderthals. So they were obviously in Europe, and they were gradually made extinct by the arrival of Homo sapiens. And I don't know how you were taught this in school. You know, it might have been something about, you know, just the natural superiority or the higher intelligence of Homo sapiens, or that they were better suited, or that just the Neanderthals just kind of died out. It just happened, you know. Other scholars like Michael Mann, the historian, not the director, who's my favorite genocide scholar. Who's your favorite genocide scholar? Let me know in the comments down below. Who have posited instead that really what happened with the Neanderthals is that this was the first instance of ethnic cleansing or of genocide that probably occurred in world history, that the Homo sapiens essentially just killed all the Neanderthals, because, you know, you have quite literally there two different kinds of human species, which is a depressing way of thinking about it, but also there is definitely some evidence supporting that theory as well. But that's kind of the sort of broad strokes archaeological periods that we're dealing with here. If we zoom in again on Austria, as a part of the Upper Paleolithic, geographically kind of very much centered in Central Europe, you have the Gravettian period, which is between 33,000 and 22,000 years ago. This is a time period where we've got lots of ivory and limestone carvings surviving that tell us a lot about the civilizations alive then. And one of those carvings from the Gravettian culture, which is preserved really quite immaculately, and which could be a more poetic answer of the single person to refer to as our first Austrian, is the Venus of Willendorf. So the Venus of Willendorf is a little limestone figurine of a height of only 11 centimeters, which is really short. That's 4 inches. That's shorter than my microphone right here. And of course, it's not a real person. People were shorter back then, but not that short. But she has a name, or at least, you know, Venus figurines are just a kind of sort of you know, statues, sort of, you know, honoring fertility. But the Venus of Willendorf was discovered in 1908 in a village that bears the name of Willendorf, which lies on the Danube to the west of Krems. So we're again in this region that is important for Austrian prehistory. Today, this little figurine is held in Vienna's Natural History Museum, which has a really good collection of archaeological artifacts like that, if you're into that sort of thing, you kinky pervert. But moving on to the final stage of the Stone Age, and that's the Neolithic. The Neolithic, or the New Stone Age, is a very important time, again, in human history, because here is where we see what is sometimes referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. So we already talked about the cognitive revolution. I mean, revolution is a term that is used maybe a little bit too much by archaeologists and kind of anthropologists in these contexts here, especially with the term Neolithic Revolution, which essentially correlates to the beginning of agriculture. That's the revolutionary aspect of this, that humans at some point in history started farming, which changes everything, mostly for the worse. And the thing about this idea of a Neolithic revolution, and the reason that it's become more and more contested in recent history by anthropologists and scholars more critical of that, is that it is a kind of a Eurocentric idea of looking at the world, or at least a Western bias. I mean, because it's not quite Europe, and we're looking at kind of like, what's often called the cradle of civilization here, and Mesopotamia and sort of parts of the Fertile Crescent there, where humans for the first time start farming. Except, is it really the first time? David Graeber and David Wengrow, again, in their brilliant book, The Dawn of Everything, talk about this a lot. I mean, they're very critical of this idea, and they point to the fact that this is, in some ways, simply where most excavations had taken place due to these territories being under Western control and the British and French colonial control for a decent amount of time. But that actually more recent archaeological study in other parts of the world, whether it be Africa or in the Americas or in Eastern Asia, shows that there's plenty of evidence that shows that this wasn't the first instances of agriculture, of kind of settlement in sort of proto-cities. I mean, this whole book is brilliant to delve into that. But their core argument comes down to refuting the idea of a first agricultural revolution outright. They say that in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, long regarded as the cradle of the agricultural revolution, there was in fact no switch from Paleolithic forager to Neolithic farmer. The transition from living mainly on wild resources to a life based on food production took something in the order of 3,000 years. And while agriculture allowed for the possibility of more unequal concentrations of wealth, in most cases this only began to happen millennia after its inception. In the centuries between, people were effectively trying farming on for size, play farming, if you will, switching between modes of production much as they switched their social structures back and forth. So this is important because it tells us that the agricultural revolution wasn't just one event that changed everything. What Graeber and Wengrow show in their book is that agriculture, upon its inception, proved much more flexible and adaptable to different peoples and different communities' needs that we subsequently tend to realize. That there is no logical corollary between the popularization of agriculture as a means of production and the hierarchical, unequal organization of societies that we know from the Middle Ages to today. And they cite several examples of civilizations, of city-states, of communities in antiquity, in the Fertile Crescent and beyond, that adopted agriculture but were not therefore tied to it and did not subsequently fall victim to hierarchical stratifications of society where peasants were tied to the land, as it were, dependent on the produce of the small pieces of land that they owned. There were, in fact, very different ways of going about this, of having more communal organizations where agricultural yield would be shared between communities, or also of switching back and forth, that there was nothing definitive about adopting agriculture, but that depending on seasons, for example, between summer and winter, certain communities could make the choice of reverting back to hunter-gatherer foraging structures as well. And so this directly contradicts this deterministic history of stages that other historians, such as, again, Yuval Noah Harari, fall
prey to, where the implication seems to be that, yes, agriculture, the invention of it came with a lot of bad consequences. It disempowered people. It left them at the mercy of land that they frequently didn't own themselves. But that if we want any progress to occur, then we have to go through that stage. And then this is something that just has to happen. So this is something that Graeber and Wengrow push back against in The Dawn of Everything.
And it's a brilliant book. I would really recommend this to anyone. It's a bit of a challenging read at times, but it will completely upend how you conceptualize prehistory in particular, especially for anyone that's read, the book *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari, which is not a bad book, but I mean, Graeber and Wengrow do criticize it on quite a few levels of being a bit too, broad strokes, and kind of looking at human history the way historians and anthropologists have for so long, as a kind of a history of stages where you go from a lower stage to a higher stage, and you never go back, and in a way things always get better, which I think is a very flawed way of looking at history. And it's also one that, as Graeber and Wengrow show, isn't really borne out by the facts, and that there was a lot of kind of back and forth. And again, with Schismogenesis that we talked about earlier, there's a lot of civilizations that decided to reject the idea of agriculture and practice things differently, but that we've kind of sort of forgotten about in this broad strokes view of history, as linear, as going from one to the next. And speaking of linear, the linear pottery culture is what we get in Austria during the Neolithic time period. So the linear pottery culture is when we get agriculture now spreading along the Danube, the Rhine, and the Elbe, so at least the kind of Central European parts of those rivers. And in these areas, we have very important archaeological artifacts recovered from this. We notably can point to the oldest known farming settlement on the territory of modern-day Austria. It's, again, a fairly unassuming town in Upper Austria. It's Brunn im Gebirge, which is in the district of Mödling, immediately to the southwest of Vienna city limits. And there's evidence there of farming having occurred circa 6000 BCE. BCE, by the way, is the kind of atheist or agnostic way of saying BC. It means before the Common Era rather than before Christ, and the kind of opposite to that is CE rather than AD, so saying Common Era, which I'll be doing throughout these videos. So that's the linear pottery culture here between 5500 and 4500 BCE. As the name suggests, I mean, a lot of pottery that is conserved from this time period. I mean, the level of skill is absolutely going through the roof here. You've got actual bowls and shit, although frustratingly, a lot of what has been conserved or what has been rediscovered is nowadays broken, which does, if we're being honest, suggest a level of craftsmanship that is still fairly mediocre, or at least in its infancy here. Do better, linear pottery culture. And that is where we'll be moving on to another contestant for our very first Austrian, Ötzi. Ötzi, the man in the ice. Now, my friend Ötzi here was discovered quite recently in the 1990s in the Ötztal Alps. You see where the name's coming from, which is part of the Alps on the border between Tyrol and South Tyrol, which is in present-day Italy. South of the border, for which reason Ötzi today is exhibited not in Vienna or anywhere in Austria, but in Italy, in Bolzano's Museum of Archaeology. So I guess there goes that whole thing about him being the first Austrian. Turns out he's actually the first Italian. But still remarkable, and something that every Austrian almost will be aware of to some extent, because it is a remarkable discovery made by tourists, no less. Just, casually stumbling past what they must have thought was a frostbitten corpse, which, I guess, in a way he was, but just a lot older than they probably thought. So Ötzi, a remarkably preserved mummy, is estimated to have lived during the Chalcolithic, also the Copper Age, which was in the 4th millennium BCE. Is Europe's oldest known mummy, and he is presumed to have been killed by an arrowhead to the shoulder. I mean, we can tell that he had wounds in his flesh around the shoulder. And this is important because it has at times been taken to corroborate a Hobbesian view of prehistoric existence and of human nature, as what that essentially means. Hobbesian is kind of like a violent dog-eat-dog world, that all of humankind was miserable and a lawless, anarchic, in the negative sense, zone of, just anyone taking what they thought was theirs and killing their neighbors for it. And that was only gradually changed by the advent of the modern nation state and order being guaranteed by state structures and by the state having a monopoly on violence. Another sort of, it's not quite an environmental determinist, but another kind of dodgy popular historian here, Steven Pinker, kind of took this view, and again, going back to my besties Graeber and Wengrow here, they have refuted this outright. I mean, they reject generalization just from one single example here.
So they start by quoting Pinker here, saying, "What is it about the ancients," Pinker asks at one point, "that they couldn't leave us an interesting corpse without resorting to foul play?" There is an obvious response to this. Doesn't it rather depend on which corpse you consider interesting in the first place? Yes, a little over 5,000 years ago, someone walking through the Alps left the world of the living with an arrow in his side. But there's no particular reason to treat Ötzi as a poster child for humanity in its original condition, other than perhaps Ötzi suiting Pinker's argument. Bow! But if all we're doing is cherry picking, we could just as easily have chosen the much earlier burial known to archaeologists as a Romito 2, Romito 2, after the Calabrian rock shelter where it was found. Let's take a moment to consider what it would mean if we did this. Romito 2 is the 10,000-year-old burial of a male with a rare genetic disorder known as acromesomelic dysplasia, a severe type of dwarfism, which in life would have rendered him both anomalous in his community and unable to participate in the kind of high-altitude hunting that was necessary for their survival. Studies of his pathology show that, despite generally poor levels of health and nutrition, that same community of hunter-gatherers still took pains to support this individual through infancy and into early adulthood, granting him the same share of meat as everyone else, and ultimately according him a careful, sheltered burial.
Well, anyway, that's the Chalcolithic copper. What comes after copper? Bronze and iron. Duh. During the Bronze and Iron Ages, in Austria, the predominant culture, but not just in Austria, really in Europe, the predominant culture of this time period of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age is the Hallstatt culture. So the Hallstatt culture is between 1200 and 450 BCE. That's where it's usually dated to. Named, of course, after the small village of Hallstatt. It's a place where there'll always be more tourists than locals, probably. It's very picturesque. I mean, so much so that it was apparently rebuilt in China in its entirety in a sort of Disneyland manner. And it's at the center of a region known in German as the Salzkammergut, which Salz is the German word for salt. And so this name stems from the fact that this area was a center of European salt production all the way throughout the Middle Ages. And that is the reason why Salzburg, the city, now you also know what the name of that city means, was such a powerful and wealthy city throughout the Middle Ages and early modernity, as well as it was the archbishops in Salzburg that held a monopoly on the region's salt trade. Now, we have some really impressive and some really sophisticated archaeological evidence from the Hallstatt period. I mean, again, we've got sort of pottery and jewelry, which is increasingly really beautiful, and some of it is really, really well preserved. We know of burial mounds. We know also of the underground salt mines that were being operated during this time that allowed for Hallstatt to become such a rich center of so much of European culture at this time. But at the center of all of this were not Austrians, but Celts. Right. Again, we're obviously well before a kind of Austria as a entity begins to exist here. At this time, the inhabitants of this region were Celts and not Germanic peoples as the Austrians of today are. Now, there's some scholarly debate about the precise origins of the Celts. In fact, we're probably just not quite sure where they originally came from. And it's made more difficult by the fact that they then went on to spread all over Europe. And it's quite an interesting journey that the Celts took on.
Because, of course, there's a bit of a clash there when you think of the center of Celtic culture in this time period being in the territory of modern-day Austria, but the remainders of Celtic culture today being very far removed from that in places like Ireland and Scotland. And the way this happened is that, well, I mean, you could probably answer it to yourself how this happened. I mean, it's chiefly migration, and it's also the expansion of the Roman Empire, which gradually pushed the Celts further and further to the fringes. And so in the east, the Celts went all the way to Hungary and Romania, all the way to the Black Sea coast and even Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. In the south, towards northern Italy, and all the way to the Iberian Peninsula as well, where they came to be given another name, the name of Galicia. And if you know your Spanish geography or your Spanish regional administrations, you can obviously trace the lineage there to the modern-day Spanish region of Galicia, which takes its name from that. Confusingly, Galicia in Ukraine, the region of the same name, does not share that root. Comes from a completely different Slavic word from a town of Halic in modern-day Ukraine that was sort of Romanized, Latinized by the Habsburgs when they ruled over it. Because that territory was never actually occupied or sort of settled by the Celts. But then moving westwards, Celtic expansion went all the way to France, of course, where they became to be known as the Gauls. You can see the common root there. So both with kind of Galicia and with Gaul, all of those derive from the same origin as Celtic. The C and the sort of soft G sounds being kind of just a sort of soft, hard version of the same sound. And it's quite easy with, centuries in between passing for that sound to evolve into a slightly softer, a slightly harder sound, depending on where you are. And then further north, also to the Low Countries, and then ultimately even the British Isles as well. And in the British Isles, the Celts took on other names as well. They came to be known as the Britons and the Picts. So they too are descended from the original Celts. And in the face of Roman expansion, but also subsequently, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Great Migration period and sort of Germanic tribes, again, sometimes quite violently pushing the Celts out, this led to Celtic culture being increasingly concentrated in these fringes of sort of northern coastal France, and in particular the British Isles, where you today have the descendants of those original Celts from Hallstatt living. Now, the language that is spoken, and there's different languages that are spoken in these regions as well, is probably, linguists believe, a direct descendant from the Proto-Celtic language that would have been spoken at Hallstatt. Today, the family of Celtic languages, that comprises Irish or Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic. The word is not pronounced the same whether you talk about Irish or Scottish. Welsh, of course, Manx, which is the native language of the Isle of Man. Breton and Cornish as well in Cornwall. Those are the alive ones, although Cornish and Manx were both brought back from extinction, were revived as languages, whereas Breton, Irish, Scottish and Welsh have sort of survived. They've never gone extinct. They've always been kept alive. And then you've also got plenty of extinct Celtic languages, notably Gaulish. That would have been the language of pre-Roman France, which has gone completely extinct as France was Latinized. The French language today, of course, being a Romance language taken directly from Latin. And sort of in ethno-linguistic terms, there's also a kind of distinction that can be made here between the Gaels and the Celtic Britons, which makes sense insofar as there's probably a greater degree of similarity between Irish and Scottish Gaelic and the Manx, which are the Gaels, which together, if you count them as a linguistic group, account for over 2 million, the vast majority of them, of course, living in Ireland. And then, on the other hand, the Celtic Britons, which are the Cornish, the Welsh, and the Bretons in northern France, who speak the Brittonic languages, which have nowadays fairly little in common. There's no degree of mutual intelligibility between Irish Gaelic and Welsh, for example. Those being the locations, the places that just happen to be remote enough for Celtic culture to be able to thrive and to be able to flourish and develop in its own distinct ways, and go down different routes, and morph into very different things. But anyway, all that really just to provide some further context to the Hallstatt culture, and where these extinct archaeological cultures go to, or where traces of them survive in the present day. And after the Hallstatt culture in the Iron Age, there is another culture that touched somewhat on the territory of modern-day Austria, that being the Latin culture. Don't be fooled by the name here. The core of this one is not in France, although it did cover a lot of France, but rather in Switzerland. It's a site near Neuchâtel in western French-speaking Switzerland that gives its name to the Latin culture, which again sort of stretched to most of continental Western Europe. So the center of the Latin culture had now moved westward, away from Austria. This lasted until the period of Roman domination, so it's commonly given as the year 1 BCE. So kind of when we get into the Common Era, the year 1, we have essentially kind of the end of the Iron Age. Although, again, these markers are very contingent on the exact territory that we are actually looking at here, because you'll find, many sort of communities in Africa and Asia that continued using iron as their kind of chief material well into the first couple of centuries of the Common Era. Which I suppose begrudgingly brings me to the Romans. I suppose you can't really skip over them when making any kind of European history, but at the same time I don't really want to be another guy on YouTube talking about the Roman Empire. Hot take here: the Romans kind of suck. I don't know. Do you agree? But they are relevant here. But I specifically decided not to do a separate video about Austria and Roman rule, but kind of condense it along with this. So I'm not going to delve too much into the overall context of the Roman Empire, just because I can't really be bothered. Am I bothered though? But to kind of just circle back a little bit to the Latin culture, and to sort of how it was that Austria was integrated into the territory of the Roman Empire. This happened because Austria, even after sort of the Latin culture shifted slightly, the focus slightly westward, Austria was still a hugely important part of European trade networks, for the simple reason that it lay right on the Amber Road, which was definitely one of the most popular roads in those centuries, the first couple of centuries BCE, because it was where amber, along other things, but in particular amber, was traded between the Mediterranean and Baltic seas. And if even today, if you try to walk from there to there, you'll find that there's easiest way to get there is through the territory of Austria. And so during the time of the Latin culture, in circa 200 BCE, you have Celtic tribes in Austria for the first time making what we can sort of call a proto-state, a polity, a loose tribal kingdom of sorts. There's considerable debate in history with how far back we can go and call something kind of like a state, even in the absence of all the accoutrements that we would nowadays associate with a state. But it was a kind of territorial entity with some level of monopoly on the violence in that territory. And that's usually a pretty good definition of at what point can we speak of a state. You have to have that certain level of central authority. And in the case of Austria, that happens with Noricum. So Noricum, which is, of course, a Roman name for good reason, initially exists as, again, this sort of kind of polity ruled by the Celts, and which gradually became a major trading partner of what at this point was still the Roman Republic. Particularly valuable was the ore mined in the region of Carinthia in the south of present-day Austria. You had Virunum, which is essentially near modern-day Magdalensberg, a small town near Klagenfurt, being a major production and trading center for skilled blacksmiths that were producing weaponry for Roman troops. And so the finished arms that were produced there at Virunum would then be transported onward to a major Roman city, the nearest Roman city to Noricum, Aquileia, which lies on the Friulian coast of Italy, sort of to the northwest of Trieste and to the south of Udine, which is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site for its very well-preserved archaeological ruins. And so from that kind of economic trading bond that Noricum, that the Celts of Noricum established with the Romans, this gradually grew into military support as well. Noricum was, in fact, a key ally of the Romans during the wars of Julius Caesar, who fought Caesar's civil war against Pompey and won. And then after that, Noricum was kind of weakened or was vassalized to such an extent that the Romans were able to take it over and to fully integrate it, make it an integral part of the empire. That act of formal integration into the institutions of the Roman Empire then came under Emperor Augustus in the year 16 BCE. And from that point on, the territory of modern-day Austria would remain part of the Roman Empire for almost half a millennium, for almost 500 years, all the way until the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE. Now, I've made the point before of sort of questioning, when does a polity, a territory, constitute a state? And to some level, we can even question that with the Roman Empire, which seems sort of like an easy, yes to whether it was a state or not. I mean, with the Roman Empire came a degree of, central administration and infrastructure that had previously been unprecedented in the territory of modern-day Austria, along with the rest of Europe. But even then, the integration of Austria into those institutions was only gradual. So I said Augustus was the emperor that oversaw the kind of, annexation is perhaps the more accurate word, of Austria into the Roman Empire. And it was only decades later under Claudius, who was also, by the way, the first Roman emperor to be born outside of Italy in present-day Lyon in France, who was emperor after the chaotic reign of Caligula and restored stability, who took more effective steps at integrating Noricum, which, that name is a Roman name, so that the name for the province was the same as the name that the Romans had given to this sort of independent Celtic state that had pre-existed it. And it was under Claudius that Noricum then got to enjoy all the advantages of being, part of the Roman Empire, urbanization and infrastructure and increased trade, but also the disadvantages, and a huge disadvantage, of course, being the disappearance of the Celtic Norican culture, of which the only traces persisting in Austria today are of an archaeological nature, right? There's basically no elements of Celtic culture that survive in Austrian culture today, and that is due to these almost 5 centuries of Roman domination, where the remainders of that culture were basically fully extinguished. Now, I've got to check myself here because I spoke of Noricum as if that was Roman Austria. That's not entirely true. The frontiers obviously don't overlap at all with modern-day frontiers between nation states. And Austria, while almost entirely under Roman rule, was in fact split among 3 different Roman provinces, Noricum just being one of them in kind of the central parts of Austria, whereas further west there was the province of Rhaetia, which is essentially the border regions between Austria, Liechtenstein, Italy, Switzerland, and Germany. The capital of this region was Augsburg, obviously named after Emperor Augustus. So you see how far north Rhaetia extended, and that name too is preserved today in notably Rätoromance, the kind of indigenous native language of parts of Switzerland, and in Austria that comprised in particular the regions of Vorarlberg and Tyrol. And then to the east of the country there was a separate province of Pannonia, which comprised essentially the non-Alpine parts of Austria, which is a fairly small part of the country, but notably including Vienna, as well as kind of parts of Lower Austria there to the east, and the region of Burgenland as well, and then extending well into Hungary, all the way up to Budapest, Slavonia and Serbia in the south as well, Croatia as far as Zagreb, but not into Dalmatia, the coastal parts of Croatia, which were a different Roman province, and also parts of Slovenia. And in Pannonia, you had probably the 2 most important Roman Austrian cities, which were Vindobona and Carnuntum. So Vindobona is the predecessor to today's Vienna, capital of Austria, and it was built on the southern shores of the river Danube in northeastern Austria. Incidentally, this is still today where the vast majority of Vienna's population lives, although the name Vienna doesn't in fact derive from Vindobona, despite the apparent similarity. The etymology says there's no connection there. Instead, Vienna, which is in German Wien, is derived from the river that runs through Vienna, or at least the other river that runs through Vienna, the much smaller one, not the Danube, but the river Wien, which is a tiny tributary of the Danube, and which probably derives from a Celtic word, here we go again, which would probably mean something like forest, or forest river. So that's apparently where the name Vienna comes from. And so Vindobona was built at the end of the 1st century CE in the same way that most Roman cities or Roman settlements were built, which was as a military camp, as a garrison to defend against invaders. So we are very much at the northern fringes of the Roman Empire here. Essentially, as a kind of rough rule, the rivers Danube in the north and the Rhine in the west constituted the boundaries of the Roman Empire to the north and west. And north of that mighty river, you had the barbarian tribes, in the terminology of the Romans, that had to be kept away through border fortifications, which are known as the limes. There's plenty of evidence of those surviving still. I mean, you've got obviously famously Hadrian's Wall in the UK, and they are also generally preserved as a UNESCO World Heritage Site as the frontiers of the Roman Empire. Although notably, however, this border, this frontier to the barbarian, lawless land of the north wasn't as strict as you might imagine, because in fact, in times of peace, and there were plenty of times of peace as well, there was a great amount of trade, of mutual use between the Romans and between the barbarian Germanic tribes to the north of the Danube. Now, at its peak, Vindobona counted a population of probably as much as 20,000 people. However, it was not the largest Austrian city in Roman territory. That would be Carnuntum, which was further downstream on the Danube, still in Lower Austria, very close to the Slovak border. There's a brilliant archaeological park there, where great amounts of digging are still going on, and new discoveries are regularly being made, but there's incredibly well-preserved remnants of the Roman period there. And Carnuntum was, importantly, the headquarters of the Pannonian fleet, which was the Roman navy sailing through Central Europe along big rivers such as the Danube. And Carnuntum had a population of almost 50,000 people at its peak, and was indeed for long stretches of time the capital of Pannonia, although I believe Vindobona was also at times the capital of Pannonia. They were both important cities. Now, one way that we know about the importance of Carnuntum is because none other than Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor, lived there, or settled there for several years while he was fighting the Marcomannic Wars against barbarian tribes to the north. I mean, anytime I say barbarian, just understand that I'm saying it in inverted commas, but that's one of those problematic historiographical terms that has stuck, and everyone knows what we mean when we talk about it. But in this specific context, there were two tribes. There were the Marcomanni in the west and the Quaedi in the east, that both Germanic peoples that were increasingly staging incursions into Roman territory. And, you know, there's very good reasons for this, for these kinds of migrations and the kind of incursions here, as there are good reasons for most of the Great Migration period of the first millennium. You know, it's not a grass is greener on the other side mentality that, you know, makes entire tribes of people set off. In this specific instance, it is the Antonine Plague, which was unleashing huge, enormous destruction across Europe around the time of the late 2nd century when the Marcomannic Wars were taking place. In the Roman Empire alone, it is believed that the Antonine Plague claimed some 10% of the entire Roman population, which is anywhere between 5 and 10 million deaths. And it is in that tumult, in that great upheaval, that we have the Marcomanni and the Quaedi moving farther south into Roman territory. We have the Marcomannic Wars with Marcus Aurelius eventually defeating these two tribes. And as the emperor was staying in Carnuntum, he wrote a very important book that is preserved to the present day, which are the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, which is considered one of the greatest examples of Stoic philosophy, of Stoicism, which originally comes from ancient Greece. It's a Hellenistic philosophy from as early as the 3rd century BCE, which at its core lays emphasis on individual virtue and duty and acceptance. So it's, in short, a philosophy of resilience, of kind of accepting one's lot and of being sort of the strong, silent type about it. It's an incredibly influential school of philosophy that has created many of the common sense paradigms that we take for granted today. You know, idioms like take it on the chin, that can broadly be classified as an example of Stoicism in action. And over the centuries or millennia since, it's incredibly fascinating how those core beliefs developed by the Greeks and then further refined by Marcus Aurelius have been repurposed, reused, reframed, recycled in almost all of the major ideological belief systems that have held sway in Europe and the West. You know, that focus on the individual, on being strong, which of course is an ideology that at the end of the day serves the ruling classes. It's one that we can see recurring in everything from Christianity, whether it's Catholic or Protestant, to imperialism, to capitalism, to also Enlightenment era universalism. And it's quite fascinating how influential Stoicism has been in this regard. And you don't have to agree with it to recognize that the Meditations are therefore an incredibly important book, an incredibly influential book with reverberations all the way to the present day. I believe this was the first time as well that I have uttered the C word in these videos, Christianity, which will, of course, be, in particular in its Catholic variety, incredibly important throughout all the rest of Austrian history that we are yet to embark on. And so I will leave the discussion of Austria's Christianization, of the early Christians in Austria, and of the kind of false starts of Christianity during the centuries that followed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, to the next video, in which I'll be going into the Great Migrations and also the early medieval period on the territory of Austria. But we'll close this video off today with one last possible contestant for the very first Austrian, still in the days of the Roman Empire here, in the late 3rd century, and in Lower Austria's Mostviertel, so kind of the area around St. Pölten, where a certain Saint Florian von Lorch, was born and became a commander in the Roman army. And the reason that he was later sanctified and is remembered and is today one of the kind of chief saints of Austria. He's the patron saint of Upper Austria, of the Upper Austrian capital of Linz, also of the entire country of Poland, and then also the patron saint of, I believe, chimney sweeps and firefighters. And on top of that, there's plenty of Florians about in Austria. It continues to be a very popular given name for boys. Reason for that is that Saint Florian died a martyr's death during the period of the Roman Empire known as the Diocletianic persecution, which is when Emperor Diocletian tried one last stand against Christianity before his successors would ultimately come to embrace the religion and proceed to Christianize the Roman Empire. So this is between 303 and 313, the last, but also the most severe period of persecution of Christians that we have in the Roman Empire before it becomes the standard religion. And so given the importance that Christianity would subsequently hold on the development of Austrian history, perhaps it's not too exaggerated to think of St. Florian as the first Austrian. Perhaps not. You might disagree. At the end of the day, I guess we might come back to the question and ask, how important is it really to determine who the first Austrians were? At least now, I hope you have a bit of a better knowledge of this early period, the prehistory of Austria, before in the next video, I'm going to proceed to look at the Dark Ages and ask how dark they really were, and look at the things that were happening on the territory of Austria during that time frame. I hope you've enjoyed this. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'd be grateful if you subscribed, liked, pointed out the potential oversights I've made. I mean, this is all just done by myself. And otherwise, all the love. Goodbye. Servus. Auf Wiedersehen.